Hello, world out there. Let me adjust my seat. Hi, this is Sherston here, and just wanted to give a book review because this book has just inspired me and motivated me and gotten me thinking in terms of solutions instead of problems. So, this is the book we're looking at. This is Vandana Shiva's Who Really Feeds the World? And the subtitle, The Failures of Agribusiness and the Promise of Agroecology. So I'm going to start by just saying a little bit about the author, Vandana Shiva. If you guys don't know who she is and you love organic food, do familiarize yourself with her. She does have a PhD. Her title is Dr. Vandana Shiva. And she started an organization called Navdanya. And Navdanya means 9 seeds, and it is basically for seed biodiversity and for the farmers of India so that they can freely exchange seeds, save seeds, and anything to do with organic farming and recultivating and giving back to the farmers so they can rejuvenate their crops. So a little synopsis of the book. Definitely check out Navdanya, her organization. And I'm just reading from notes now. This is a powerful and thoroughly researched book. In my opinion, it should be required reading for every human breathing on the earth that can read. The book examines global trade, ecology, homogenization of crops, the green revolution, globalization, seed sovereignty, and human rights. Vandana doesn't just tell you the problems. She walks you through every step of history that got us here for the past 100 years. Vandana provides real examples in her work of world hunger and what solutions and or problems the WTO brought to those countries by claiming ownership over their seed supply. Lastly, Vandana leaves us with a well spelled out solution with 9 steps to take back control of our food systems. The book is one of the best books I've read. Please excuse my dog for a second. Rudder! Psst. There is a gopher tortoise in the yard, and much like the squirrels like to, the gopher tortoise likes to come over and taunt him. One moment, please. Rudder! Rudder! Cut it out! All right, we're almost done here. I want to read an excerpt from the book. And the reason I want to read this, for those of you who are familiar with me, I've done a lot of journalism in the last decade regarding some of these big issues, such as GMOs, such as globalism. And really, it's funny because the younger generation goes around saying, eat local, buy local, but they don't really understand where that came from. That didn't exist 100 years ago. That was your only option. Where that came from was globalization. So this is one of the best explanations and breakdowns of what are the issues with globalization that I've ever read in my entire life. And if I could get the president to read this excerpt instead of make his blundering speeches, I would, because this would be a lot more helpful. All right. Over the last 20 years, the globalization of food and agricultural systems has been presented as a natural and inevitable phenomenon. However, there is nothing natural about globalization, and in particular, the globalization of food. The first wave of globalization began in the 17th century and was driven by Europe, which sought to control the spice trade from India. This is what led to the establishment of the East India Company and the signing of the first free trade agreement. And she has free trade agreement in quotes between the East India Company and the collapsing Mughal Empire. But the East India Company traded in spices, not staple foods. In fact, until the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1995, I didn't even realize that it was only 1995. When I read that, I was like, oh my gosh. Food was a subject of local and national sovereignty, not of global trade. The rules of global trade have been written by corporations in order to expand their control over food and agriculture, and thus increase their profits. The idea that free trade is based on competition is a myth. It has led to monopolies, with just 5 gene giants controlling seed: Monsanto, Syngenta, DuPont, Bayer, and Dow. 5 grain giants controlling grain supply. 5 processing giants controlling food and beverage processing: PepsiCo, JBS, Tyson Foods, Danone, and Nestle. And 5 retail giants controlling food, retail: Walmart, Carrefour, Metro Group, Aeon, and Tesco. At this point, I'd like to throw in my own 2 cents and point out that it's very interesting, this number 5, because it happens to be 5 big corporations that control all of our media. Coincidence? Perhaps. Just as false claims of feeding the world have been made about industrial agriculture as a model of production, false claims have been made about feeding the world through globalization and free trade as a model of distribution. The reality is the opposite. Globalization has created displacement, unemployment, hunger, and food insecurity on an unprecedented scale. While the language used is free trade and competition, corporate globalization consists of unfair and unfree trade. Globalization was imposed with the argument that it would do 2 things for food. First, that it would increase food production under the theory that corporations are better at producing large amounts of things than small groups of people. And second, that it would make food cheaper and therefore more accessible for the poor. Both these claims are lies. As far as food production goes, we've already seen how the myth of more produces less through monocultures, large farms, and poisons. And that's earlier in the book that she explains the law of return, which is basically the organic law of, that all farmers used to follow, is that you give back to the soil and you get more from it, right? That's in a nutshell. As far as food production goes, we've already seen how the myth of more produces less through monocultures, large farms, and poisons. In fact, globalization doesn't produce food, it produces commodities. 90% of the corn and soy grown in the world is used for biofuel or animal feed because that's where the largest profits lie. Commodities don't feed people, they create hunger. As far as cheap food goes, globalized food is actually produced at a very high cost. Listen up, everybody. And if it weren't for the fact that agribusiness collect more than 400 billion in subsidies in rich countries, the entire food system would collapse. Input costs, including fertilizers, pesticides, machinery, always higher than the value of what is traded. And without these subsidies, the system of globalized mechanized food production would not work. These subsidized commodities are then in turn sold to poor countries, which are forced to dismantle their border protections so that rich nations can dump artificially cheap commodities into the developing world. To add to this, volatile global prices resulting from financial speculation further entrench a system that takes from farmers and people and gives to corporations and governments. Globalization is implemented through neoliberal economic reform policies, which deregulate both domestic and international commerce, privatize public goods, and create a framework that accepts corporate rule. Today, the world's food supply is in crisis. This crisis has multiple facets. First, the ecological costs of intensive, fossil fuel intensive industrial agriculture are massive and are leading to climate change, biodiversity erosion, water depletion, and soil erosion. Second, globalized industrial agriculture is leading to the mass displacement of small-scale farmers, where on the one hand, growing debt has pushed hundreds of thousands of farmers to suicide, and on the other hand, mass unemployment is feeding into different forms of extremism. Third, it is in the design of industrial food production to create hunger, malnutrition, and disease. Hunger is created by debt in situations where farmers are forced to sell what they grow. It is created by dumping, which destroys livelihoods, and it is created by turning food into a commodity for long-distance trade, which wastes large amounts of food. Every dimension of the food crisis, non-sustainability, injustice, unemployment, hunger, and disease, is linked to the globalized, industrialized food system. And every dimension of this crisis can be addressed through ecological, agricultural, and local food systems. To grow sustainability, nutrition, and food democracy, we must think small, not big, local, not global. Globalization benefits the wealthy, including wealthy countries, and exploits the poor. This is done in the name of free trade, enacted through trade liberalization or the dismantling of governmental restrictions on what and how much can be imported into a country. It is closely linked to the entrenchment of privatization because when governments are forced to take a back seat through policies enforced by organizations such as the WTO, private companies step in and fill the gap. Trade liberalization is touted as an opening up of a country's borders to allow the easy flow of goods and services. In reality, the only stakeholders who benefit from these agreements are large private companies and rich nations. Over the last 2 decades, neoliberal policies have devastated livelihoods and food security across the world. Trade liberalization forces poor countries to remove their import barriers, which leaves them vulnerable to dumping. The process by which commodities that are subsidized in the global north are dumped in large quantities into countries in the global south. This creates the artificial impression that cheaper goods are now available in poorer countries. However, what this actually does is destroy local sources of food production and distribution, including the farmers' livelihoods. In 1998, when quantitative restrictions or import barriers were first dismantled in India, several commodities were dumped in order to undercut local food sources. Soy at the time was sold in the international market by the United States at $150 per metric ton. However, the subsidy behind the production of the soy given to the large farms and companies was $190 per metric ton. So what costs legitimately $150 actually cost $150 plus $190. So the government's deciding what we eat, and they're giving us the cheapest stuff they can. As this artificially cheap product flooded Indian markets, it began to undercut local farmers and local food production. This happened across crops, where once the price of a coconut in Kerala was 10 rupees, after the dismantling of quantitative restrictions, it fell to just 2 rupees per unit. People in Kerala, the land of the coconut, began chopping down their trees and resorted to growing cash crops or selling their land. One significant treaty that has allowed dumping to carry on at the expense of poorer countries is the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union, which is a system, and that's the name of the policy, Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which is a system of agricultural subsidies. It was first implemented in 1962, but has since been revised several times to allow for larger scale dumping into poorer countries. In Jamaica, the dumping of heavily subsidized EU skim milk powder has led to a collapse in local dairy production. Ironically, EU dairy farmers have largely failed to benefit from the subsidies because payments are made directly to large food processing companies rather than the farmers that produced the milk that then was dried and sold. In West Africa, between 10 and 11 million farmers lost 200 million as a direct result of US subsidies, which are enacted through the US Farm Bill. In South Africa, research shows that the European Union's sugar regime has enabled high-cost European farmers to benefit at the expense of much more efficient South African producers, resulting in lost jobs and revenue in a country battling HIV and AIDS and the legacy of apartheid. Farmers in the Global South see CAP and the U.S. Farm Bill as the worst examples of Northern double standards, summed up as "you liberalize, we subsidize." Due to the high levels of subsidies in the Global North, the removal of protective barriers transmits distorted price signals to domestic markets, which in turn pushes prices downward below survival levels. This also creates an imbalance in domestic supply and demand, and as we will explore toward the end of the chapter, begins to aggressively reshape what food people have access to. The policies of trade liberalization go over and above dumping. These policies, touted as the pillars of liberalization, have undermined the government's role in ensuring food security for people and livelihood security for farmers. Advocates of trade liberalization call governmental measures meant to aid people trade distorting and demand that these be scrapped. In this way, when farmers and local producers are being put out of business by large quantities of imported goods, governments are unable to step in and help. At the same time, rather than encourage communities' initiatives, trade liberalization has encouraged policies that give agribusiness increasing control over the food production and distribution system through programs such as privatization, market access, removal of quantitative restrictions on imports. An obvious example of the policy shift from people-centered concerns to trade and corporation-centered concerns is the fact that farmers are not allowed by law to take their produce beyond state borders, whereas traders can pick up the produce from anywhere and take it anywhere. In fact, governments, after forcibly taking away land from farmers and communities, are building superhighways to connect centers of agriculture production to airports and ports, so the corporations can quickly transport these commodities for export. Whereas countries were once exporters, they have now become importers. In other words, they have moved from food independent, self-sufficient economies to food dependent economies. India, for example, has one of the largest vegetable oil economies in the world and ranks first in the world's production of castor, safflower, sesame, and Niger oil. In the span of a decade, from 85 to 96, oilseed production more than doubled, and India achieved self-sufficiency. From 1990 to 1991, India exported 10, wow, I don't know how to read this number. It's 10,000 million of oil seeds. So it's a lot. Oh, yeah, that's how she wrote it. So I'm not sure what number that is. From 1991 to 1992, this went up to 16,500 million. However, with the introduction of trade liberalization and the dismantling of import barriers in 1998, India went from being a net exporter to a net importer of edible oils. By 2001, India was importing $133 million of edible oils. And by 2003, the import bill had jumped to 940 million, which accounts for 63% of our agri imports. In 92, Indonesian farmers produced enough soy to supply the entire domestic market. Soy-based tofu and tempeh are important parts of the daily diet across the, I don't know how to say this, archipelago. Following the implementation of a doctrine, the country opened its borders to food imports. Soy, in other words, heavily subsidized, to flood the market. This destroyed production, and today 60% of the soy consumed in Indonesia is imported. Record prices for U.S. soy in 2007 led to a national crisis in Indonesia when the price of tempeh and tofu, known as the meat of the poor, doubled in just a few weeks. According to the FAO, the food deficit in West Africa increased by 81% 95 to 2004. Now, let's not forget, 95 is when the WTO says it's going to end world hunger by making us grow all this stuff and buy chemicals and buy inputs, and the farmers have to buy seed every single time they plant it. They don't get to, there's no seeds coming out of the GMO or hybrid plants, so they have to buy from this corporation to get seeds every time. However, according to the International Fund for Agricultural Development, 2007, the region has the potential to produce sufficient amounts of food. All across the world, liberalization goes on, even though it is increasing countries' vulnerabilities. The proponents of globalization depict trade liberalization as a policy intended to benefit all parties, and one that countries in the global south have voluntarily signed up for. In reality, large companies and rich nations have put immense pressure on poorer countries to deregulate trade and open their markets to cheap imports. And that's all I'm going to read for today. But I would say her last sentence of saying large companies and rich nations have put immense pressure on poorer countries and deregulated trade and opened their markets to cheap imports. Immense pressure is not the right words there. No, it's called force. And let's not mention all of the regime change wars since 1995. Interesting that we have all of these regime change wars after the good old WTO comes along to save us from our planet. Anywho, keep thriving. Read this book. It is so inspiring. She is a gem. I hope, Vandana, that you are happy and healthy and live to be far beyond 100 years old. And just wishing everyone inspiration, motivation, and solution thinking. And that's all I got for today. Mwah. Love, love, love.